My daughter-in-law called me uneducated, so she said my grandchildren will never be allowed to visit me again. That was the moment I knew. Not just that my daughter-in-law disliked me. Not just that she'd drawn a line. But that she had finally said out loud what I'd always suspected she whispered behind my back. Uneducated. That was her word. Not different. Not out of touch. Uneducated. Like I was a stain on their lives. And now, because of that word, because of a label I never asked for, my grandchildren, my entire reason for getting up some days, were being used as bargaining chips. And I wasn't going to stay silent anymore. It started on a quiet Sunday afternoon. The kind where the light filters through your window just right and your tea cools before you remember to drink it. I was folding laundry and humming to myself when the phone rang. I saw my son's name, Eric. My heart did a hopeful little flutter. Maybe the kids wanted to come by. Maybe they missed their grandma's banana bread. Maybe, just maybe, things were about to turn around. "Hi, sweetheart," I answered. "Everything okay?" There was a long pause. Too long. "Hi, Mom." "Yeah. Listen, I need to tell you something before you hear it from Karen." "Karen? What about her?" "My daughter-in-law. The woman who never called me Mom, never thanked me for anything I did, and never once came into my house without scanning the room like she was expecting mold on the walls." I sat down slowly. "Go on." He sighed. "She's upset. Says you were inappropriate last time the kids were over." Inappropriate? I blinked. "All I did was help them with their homework. We baked cookies. She said you corrected their grammar. That you told them school isn't the only place to learn things." I closed my eyes. Because it isn't. And they were asking questions I knew the answers to. "I know, Mom. I know. But she says you're trying to undo their education. She says it's confusing them." My voice cracked. "Eric, I only wanted to help." Another pause. "Look, she doesn't want them coming over anymore. Not for a while." And there was, delivered in the same voice he used when he broke his arm at 9 and tried to convince me it wasn't that bad. "Is that what you want?" I asked softly. "I just want peace, Mom. Please don't make this harder." "But peace for who?" "Certainly not for me." I didn't cry that day. I didn't scream. I folded the last of the laundry, placed it in the drawer, and sat in the chair where my grandkids used to curl up beside me with storybooks. The house felt louder in its silence than it ever had before. Karen wasn't always like this. When she first met Eric, she was charming, sweet even. She brought flowers when they came to dinner. He complimented my meatloaf. But once the ring was on her finger and the wedding photos were posted on Facebook, something changed. She began referring to me as your mother instead of Mom. She corrected the kids when they called me Grandma Jules, and made them say Grandmother Julia because it sounded more refined. And when I told her I'd never finished high school because I left early to care for my sick parents, her smile got thinner. More polite. But colder. From that moment on, she treated me like a broken relic from another time. A few weeks later, I got a message from my neighbor's teenage daughter, Lila. "Mrs. Barrett, your granddaughter posted a video on TikTok. He said she misses you. I thought you'd want to see it." My heart leapt. I didn't have TikTok, but I begged Lila to show me. It was a short clip. My granddaughter, Elise, 10 years old, sitting in her room whispering to the camera like she was telling a secret. "I miss Grandma Jules. I miss her cookies and how she always lets me read out loud. I don't know why Mommy says she's not good for us. He always made me feel smart. Even when I mess up." I watched it 3 times. Then I asked Lila how to save it. That video became my anchor. Proof that no matter what Karen said, my love still mattered. My presence still meant something. And I wasn't about to be erased. I began writing a journal. Not for me. For Elise and her little brother, Tommy. A record of memories. Of stories. Of what I would have told them if I was allowed to tuck them in or walk them home from school. I titled it, "When You're Ready to Remember Me." Instead I wrote, "Your grandmother doesn't have degrees. But she has lessons. I may not have worn a cap and gown, but I wore an apron while holding 3 jobs, raised your father while the world told me I couldn't, and learned everything I needed from life itself." Eric texted me the next month. "Karen says if you apologize, she might reconsider the visits." I didn't reply. Because I wasn't sorry. Not for loving them. Not for teaching them things outside a textbook. Not for refusing to let a cruel word like uneducated rewrite the truth of my life. Weeks turned into months. Each Sunday I still made banana bread and placed it on the windowsill, just in case. And each night I added another entry to the journal. Memories, recipes, poems, photographs with little notes scribbled on the back. Until it grew so thick I had to wrap it in twine. I labeled the bundle with a sticky note. For Elise and Tommy. From the woman who will always be waiting. Then one afternoon a knock at the door. I opened it expecting mail. But it was Elise. Alone. 10 years older. Now 20. Now tall. Now bold. She held up the journal I'd sent her on her 18th birthday. It took me a while, she said. But I read every page. I said nothing. She stepped forward and hugged me so tight it took my breath away. And whispered like she had when she was a child. I always knew you weren't what she said. Elise's arms around me were no longer the fragile arms of a child. They were strong now. Confident. But in that hug I still felt the tiny girl who used to climb into my lap with a crayon-stained drawing and whisper, "Don't tell Mommy, but I like your cookies better." When she pulled away, her eyes were damp, but her face had peace written all over it. "I didn't tell anyone I was coming," she said. "I didn't want to give them a chance to talk me out of it." I nodded slowly. "You don't owe anyone an explanation." She smiled gently. "I wanted to see you. I wanted to remember things for myself. Not through someone else's bitterness." We sat on the porch with the breeze moving gently through the wind chimes. I brought her a slice of banana bread and a cup of sweet tea just like I used to. She took a bite and laughed softly. "It still tastes exactly like I remember." I looked at her. "You remember?" "I never forgot, Grandma." That word. Grandma. For years I wasn't allowed to hear it. To Karen I was always Julia. She said Grandma sounded too informal, too country. Said it wasn't good for Elise and Tommy to grow up with bad habits. But here Elise sat calling me Grandma like it was the most natural word in the world. As it was. She pulled the journal from her bag and laid it flat on the table. "I want to talk about this," she said. "I don't think I ever understood what happened when I was a kid. One day we were visiting every week and the next, it was like you disappeared." I took a breath. I hadn't rehearsed for this. I didn't want to poison her against her parents. That was never my goal. "I didn't disappear," I said. "I was pushed out. By Mom." I didn't reply. I didn't have to. "She told us you didn't respect her boundaries. That you were interfering with how we were being raised." I chuckled sadly. "Your mom didn't like that I told you learning doesn't stop when the bell rings. That there's just as much value in baking bread or planting tomatoes as there is in test scores." "I know that now," Elise said. "But back then I was just confused. She made it seem like you were the problem." "I wasn't perfect," I admitted. "But I loved you. And that should have been enough." Elise looked down. "She used to say you were uneducated. That you were too simple to influence us." That word again. Uneducated. Like not finishing high school meant I couldn't raise a son, survive a broken marriage, care for dying parents, and still show up for every school concert and doctor's appointment. "I may not have letters after my name," I said, "but I have earned every line on this face and every callus on these hands." "You don't have to convince me," Elise said. "I came back because I know who you are." She stayed the night. We didn't talk about Karen anymore. We made stew together just like old times. She picked basil from my garden, and we watched an old black and white movie with a blanket draped over our laps. That night I tucked her in like she was still 10 and I whispered, "You're always welcome here." And she whispered back, "So is Tommy. He just doesn't know how to say it yet." The next morning she left before sunrise. But she left a note on the fridge. "Grandma, you taught me what quiet strength looks like. You didn't yell. You didn't fight back with cruelty. You waited. You wrote. You believed. And now I believe too. Thank you for not disappearing when they told us you did." Elise Purple Heart. A week later I got a call. From Tommy. His voice had deepened. I barely recognized it. "Grandma, I know it's been a while. Elise told me she saw you. I was wondering if I could come too." My voice caught. "Of course, sweetheart. You never needed an invitation." He chuckled. "She was right. You do still call us that. Sweetheart." I laughed through my tears. "Always will." Tommy's visit was quieter. More tentative. But when he arrived he walked right up to my front porch and hugged me like he meant it. I didn't know what to think all those years, he said. It always felt like something was missing. You weren't missing anything, I said. You were being kept away from it. He walked the garden with me, asked about every flower like he hadn't been raised to avoid dirt. And when we passed the corner where my wind chimes hung, he stopped. Didn't I used to sit under this tree with a popsicle? You did. He looked up at me. Why'd they make it so hard for us to be here? I didn't answer. Some questions don't need answers, they just need space. So I placed a hand on his shoulder and said, You're here now. That's what matters. That night after they'd both gone, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and the journal beside me. It was worn now. Dog-eared. Ink smudged. But it had done its job. Not because it changed Karen, but because it waited for the right eyes to open. And they did. Eric never called to apologize. Karen never admitted what she did. But Elise and Tommy? They came back. They remembered. Because you can lie about a woman's education. You can twist her words. You can even shut her door. But you cannot erase the way she made you feel. Not when it was real. Not when it was love. They didn't just come back. They stayed. Not every day. Not in the way they used to when they were small and curled beside me under a blanket. But they stayed in the most important way. They called. They visited. They remembered. And that was more than I ever thought I'd get. It began with once-a-month dinners. Elise would bring a new recipe she wanted to try, and we'd make it together in my old kitchen. One night she pulled out a recipe for saffron risotto and we both burst out laughing. That's going to bankrupt us, I said, eyeing the price tag on the saffron. We'll split the cost, she said. Fair and square. I've got a job now, remember? Her job was in community outreach for a local women's initiative. She helped women get access to education, scholarships, training. I guess I'm passing it on, she told me once. What you gave me. It humbled me. Because for years I thought I was just writing in a journal, whispering into silence. But those whispers had become her compass. Tommy came by on Sundays. We'd garden. He'd mow the lawn even when I said not to. He'd sit with me on the porch and ask questions like, Did Grandpa ever mess up a holiday dinner? Or, were you scared the first time you drove a car? He told me I made things feel safe. And I realized then, that's what had been missing all along. Karen had given them structure. I had given them safety. And when you grow up with only one, you'll always long for the other. One afternoon I got a letter in the mail. Handwritten. Addressed in neat, careful print. From Karen. I opened it slowly, half expecting venom. That I read. Julia. I know you probably don't want to hear from me. But I wanted you to know. I've seen the change in Elise and Tommy. I see how calm they are after they visit. How much more sure of themselves. I don't know how to explain it except to say, maybe I was wrong. Maybe the world doesn't always need to be refined, to be good. You were good to them. I see that now. I'm not asking for forgiveness. Just recognition. That I've started to understand. I folded the letter once. Then once again. Placed it in the kitchen drawer beside my rolling pin. I didn't write her back. But I didn't need to. Some apologies don't need a reply. That weekend Elise brought me a gift. A framed photo collage of her and Tommy through the years, with one image in the center. A photo of the three of us, arms wrapped around each other, seated on my front porch steps. Taken just 2 weeks earlier. She had written at the bottom in delicate gold ink. Asterisk, education is what you're taught. Wisdom is who you learn from. Sis. I hung it in my hallway. Right beside the front door. So every time someone entered my home they'd see who I was. And who I had helped raise. Months passed. Eric came by once. Alone. He stood on my porch like a man walking into confession. I know I should have stood up to her. I stayed silent. I thought I was protecting peace. But all I did was prolong damage. So I said nothing. You were never the one who needed changing, he added. I just wanted things to be easy. I looked him straight in the eyes. Easy doesn't raise children, Eric. And it sure as hell doesn't protect mothers. He nodded. I know that now. Then with a weak smile, you taught them more than either of us ever could have. This time I nodded. Not for him, but for the girl and boy who had become people I was proud to know. It's funny what the world calls education. Degrees. Certificates. Tests. But what about patience? What about love that doesn't give up even when the door's been shut in its face? What about showing up over and over even when no one notices? That's the education I gave Elise and Tommy. And they passed with flying colors. Elise now mentors young women who grew up like I did, overlooked, undersupported, and dismissed as too simple. Tommy now teaches woodworking to boys in the neighborhood who've never had a man hug them, let alone show them how to sand a table. Me. I keep writing. I keep gardening. I keep waiting, not because I'm stuck, but because I know there are still people out there hoping to be remembered. Last week, Elise brought a little girl to visit. Her name was Lillian. My great-granddaughter. 4 years old. Bright eyes. Loud laugh. And already sassy like her grandma used to be. When Elise introduced me, she didn't say, "This is Julia." She didn't say, "This is your dad's mom." She knelt down and said, "Lillian, this is Grandma Jules. She's the one who taught me how to love without fear." And just like that, I knew the cycle had been broken. Lillian's visits stirred something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not just joy, but purpose. There she was, a wild, beautiful little spirit with her great-grandmother's stubborn chin and her mother's confidence, running barefoot across my backyard like she owned every blade of grass. She didn't care about my age, or my so-called lack of education. She just wanted stories. "Tell me something funny," she demanded one afternoon, plopping into my lap with sticky fingers and the fearlessness of a queen. So I did. I told her about the time her mother fed my cat blueberries. About how I once mistook shampoo for lotion and nearly ruined a church service with all the bubbles. She laughed so hard she hiccuped. That sound, that open, carefree laugh, was the loudest proof that the damage had not passed down. That somewhere between estrangement and healing, we had managed to stop the cycle. That evening, Elise stood in my kitchen watching Lillian lick frosting off a wooden spoon. "You know," she said quietly, "Mom still doesn't get it." I stirred the batter slowly. "Doesn't get what?" "Why I brought Lillian to you. Why I kept coming back here in the first place." I met her eyes. Because home isn't always where you sleep. Sometimes it's where you finally feel safe enough to breathe. She nodded. She still thinks education is measured by awards, trophies, titles. I shrugged. Let her. You and I know better. Elise smiled. I do. Later that night, as I was tucking Lillian into the guest room bed, the one Elise used to sleep in, she whispered, "Grandma Jules?" "Yes, baby. Why do you write so many letters?" I laughed softly. Because I want to remember the things people try to forget. She blinked up at me, sleep tugging at her eyes. "Will you write me one?" "I already have," I said. "It's on your pillow." Her little hands grabbed the envelope as if it were gold. She didn't even open it. She just hugged it to her chest. And I knew in that moment, my voice would live longer than my name ever could. That summer became a season of healing. Tommy started stopping by more often, now with a girlfriend named Renee. A kind girl who said, "Yes ma'am," even when I told her not to. Eric visited twice. Both times with Elise there as a buffer, but he came. Karen never did. But she mailed Lillian a birthday card with my address written beneath Elise's. A silent truce maybe. Or maybe just her way of saying, "I see you're still here." By fall, Elise had taken a job managing a new community center across town. She asked me to come speak at the opening. Me. I said, "What would I even say?" He grinned. "The truth. Just like you always did." So I wrote a speech. Nervous, my hands trembling, I stood before a room full of strangers and family and said, they called me uneducated. Said I wasn't good enough to teach or raise or guide. But education doesn't only live in schools. It lives in kitchens, in gardens, in the way a grandmother makes time for a child even when the world shuts her out. I never had a degree, but I had a spine, and a soft voice, and a heart that never stopped writing letters in case someone, someday, needed to remember who they were. No. I watch my granddaughter pass that truth down to hers. You tell me who's educated now. When I finished there was a pause. Then applause. Then Elise stepped forward and handed me a certificate printed on thick paper with gold script. Asterisk presented to Julia Barrett. For lifelong contribution to community education and intergenerational wisdom. It wasn't from a college. It was from hearts I'd helped shape. That night after the celebration, Elise stayed behind to help me gather things. As we packed up, she found one of my old journals tucked behind a plant on the bookshelf. This one's different, she said. I took it gently. It was the first journal. The one I started when the pain of being called unworthy was still fresh. The one that bore the tears and ink of every day I sat alone at that kitchen table. "Can I read it?" she asked. I hesitated, then handed it over. "Just be gentle with the woman in those pages," I said. She didn't know how strong she'd become. That night Elise stayed up reading. The next morning she said, "I want to publish this." I blinked. Publish? As a book. Maybe under a different name. Maybe anonymously. But people need this, Grandma. There are thousands of women who've been made to feel like less because they didn't check the right boxes. I hesitated. I hadn't written it for the world. I'd written it for survival. But maybe survival stories were the ones most worth sharing. "Okay," I whispered. "Okay." 2 months later, the book was printed under the title, "The Letters I Wrote When No One Was Listening." Author, JB. It sold slowly at first. Then suddenly, women began writing in, sharing their own stories, calling me JB in their emails. One wrote, "Asterisk, I raised 6 kids without a diploma. I was told I was useless. This book made me feel like a whole person again." Sis. Another wrote, "Asterisk, I sent it to my estranged daughter. She called me for the first time in 5 years. Sis. And so I kept writing. Not because I needed a platform, but because I had finally been heard." Elise came by one day with tears in her eyes. "I saw your book on a woman's lap at the park." She was crying and reading it like it was scripture. I took her hand. "You gave me my voice back," I said. "No," she replied. "You never lost it. You just waited for someone to listen." It arrived in spring. A plain envelope. No return address. The handwriting was familiar. Tight and perfect, like it had been pressed into the paper with tension. Karen. I hadn't seen her in over 7 years. Her name rarely came up now, not out of avoidance but irrelevance. Life had bloomed far beyond the fences she tried to keep around it. Still, when I saw that envelope, something inside me tightened. I opened it slowly, carefully, and I read, "Julia, I don't expect this letter to undo anything, but I wanted you to know that I've been reading your book." Is that book? Elise sent me a copy. She didn't ask if I'd read it. He just left it on my desk. I ignored it for weeks. Then one night I couldn't sleep, and I opened it. Page after page. "I saw you in a way I never let myself before. You didn't raise your voice, Julia. You never humiliated me, never threw my words back at me. You just quietly stayed present. You loved my children when I was too busy performing perfection to notice what they really needed. I called you uneducated. That word, it came from my own shame. My mother called me useless once. And instead of healing, I passed that infection down. You never deserved that. You were a better mother to Eric than I ever admitted. You were a better grandmother than I ever understood. I won't ask to come back into your life. That's not mine to ask. But I am sorry. Truly. And if you ever wanted to talk, I'd listen. Karen." I stared at the page for a long time. Not because I didn't believe her, but because I wasn't sure what forgiveness even looked like anymore. That afternoon I walked into the guest room, now Lillian's playroom, and picked up a framed photo of Elise, Tommy, and me at the community center opening. I held it in my hands and whispered, "You were right, Elise. Some things do find their way back." I didn't respond to the letter. Not immediately. I waited. Not out of pettiness, but because I needed to know what part of me was reacting, the wounded girl or the grown woman. A week passed. Then, on the 3rd, I sat at my desk, pulled out fresh paper and wrote, "Karen, thank you for your letter. Thank you for reading. Thank you for not dressing your apology in excuses. That matters. I don't hate you. I never did. I hated how invisible you made me feel, how small. But I have learned to live big without your permission. Elise and Tommy are whole people. Not in spite of me, but because of how I stayed present even after being erased. You did what you thought was right at the time. And now you are learning what love actually sounds like. That is enough. We don't need to become friends. But we can begin to coexist in the truth. If you'd like to meet for coffee sometime, I'll be here. I'm not going anywhere. Julia." That summer we met. 2 women on a shaded patio. Not enemies. Not even family yet. Just 2 women. One beginning to understand what the other already lived. We didn't talk about the past. We talked about Lillian's wild imagination. About Tommy's garden project. About the next book Elise wanted me to write. Karen admitted she had been in therapy, that she was trying to unlearn control, that she didn't want her granddaughter to inherit a tongue dipped in judgment. I don't want to be the voice in her head that tells her she's never enough, she said. Then make sure your voice tells her the truth, I replied. Tell her she comes from strong women. Karen looked at me, and for the first time since I'd known her, her expression softened with something I'd never seen before. Respect. We're not close. We probably never will be. But when Lillian has dance recitals now, we sit in the same row. We clap for the same little girl. And sometimes when Elise wraps her arms around me and whispers, "Thank you," Karen looks over, not with envy, but with recognition of what it takes to keep love alive, even when you're no longer invited to the table. One day Lillian asked, "Grandma Jules, are you a teacher?" I smiled. "Why do you ask?" "Because Mommy says you teach people how to be kind without making them feel bad." I laughed gently. "I guess that makes me a teacher then." She nodded, content, then skipped off to draw rainbows in the dirt. I once believed being called uneducated was the cruelest insult someone could hurl at a woman like me. Well, I wear it like a badge. Because if education is what makes you valuable, then let my life, my love, my refusal to disappear, be the curriculum. I thought they took my voice, but they only taught me how loud quiet love could be. It was Elise who gave me the idea. We were sitting on my porch, her legs tucked under her like she was still 10, watching Lillian draw on the concrete with chalk. "She wants to be a writer now," Elise said with a smile. She brought home a journal from school and started calling herself Lily B. I laughed. "Tell her I approve. Pen names run in the family." She looked over at me a little more serious now. "You should teach. Not just speak once in a while. Offer something real. There are women out there who need a voice like yours." I waved her off. What would I teach? Banana bread and broken hearts. But that night I sat at my desk and stared at my old stack of journals. Vain. The rejection. The small victories. Every page was a lesson. Every scar had something to say. So I said yes. To a small group once a week at Elise's center. 12 women. Some single moms. Some middle-aged women who'd been silenced for too long. Some young, scared, and unsure how to use the voice they'd barely discovered. We didn't talk about grammar. We talked about survival. About how you stand up again when the people closest to you try to knock you down without raising their hands. About how being called too simple, or not enough, often meant you were too strong for the ones who needed you small. About how love doesn't require a diploma. Just presence. And patience. And persistence. One evening, a woman in the back, quiet for most of the sessions, raised her hand. "Did it ever get easier?" she asked. "Not being angry?" I nodded slowly. It didn't get easier, but it got quieter. And when things get quiet, you can finally hear yourself think again. That's when healing begins. She cried. And then the woman next to her cried. And I realized they weren't broken. They were finally breaking open. Months passed. We filled 2 groups. Then 3. People started calling me Miss J, instead of Julia or Grandma Jules. I didn't mind, because they weren't saying it with condescension. They were saying it with respect. And after all these years, that word, respect, meant more to me than any degree I never earned. Elise helped me launch a newsletter. We called it The Quiet Voice. Subheading, Lessons from the Woman They Underestimated. Each week I'd send a short message to thousands of subscribers. Women from all over the country, from nursing homes to college dorms, wrote back. One said, "I read your letter every Sunday morning before church. You remind me I'm allowed to belong, even if I never became what they wanted." Another wrote, "My daughter talks to me again. Your story helped me find words that didn't sound like blame." Sometimes I'd finish writing and just sit quietly, stunned at the reach of my once silenced voice. It didn't matter how old I was. Didn't matter what I didn't have on paper. What mattered was that I showed up. And I stayed. One afternoon Karen showed up too, unannounced. She stood at my garden gate, hesitant but standing tall. I opened it without a word. She handed me a small tin box. Inside were old photographs. Elise as a toddler. Tommy in a Halloween costume I hadn't seen in years. Me blurry in the background holding them both. "I found these in a box in the garage," Karen said. I think they were yours originally. I held the box to my chest. Thank you. She nodded, unsure of what else to say. I'm trying, she said finally. I nodded too. That's all anyone can ask. She turned to leave, then paused. She'd know. Lillian talks about you like you invented the moon. That made me smile. To her, maybe I did. That night, I added the photos to my journal collection. I didn't write about Karen. I didn't need to. Some things aren't about recording. They're about releasing. A year passed. I turned 61. Lillian wrote me a poem for my birthday. In it, she called me a quiet warrior. Because, she said, you don't fight with swords. You fight with soup and letters and hugs. I cried. Of course I did. Because in a world that once told me I was too little to matter, here stood a child who believed I held galaxies in my arms. Oh. Now I teach. I write. I bake. Tommy visits every Sunday. Elise brings Lillian every Friday afternoon. Karen sometimes drops off flowers, not to be seen but to be counted. And I keep a single framed note beside my bed. A copy of the very first letter I wrote in my darkest days. Asterisk, you are not irrelevant. You are not uneducated. You are not alone. You are love made patient. And you are still here. So write. Sis. They tried to silence me with labels. But I taught my family what a quiet revolution looks like. Not with shouting, but with staying. With loving harder when it hurt. With returning, again and again until the door finally opened.